And just a side note too, Darren mentioned all the mechanical telecom stuff and things like that, and he was going to skip over it. If you want to talk about that with me later, I love nerding out on that stuff, so just let me know. My plan today is to go over 4.1, 4.2, some other highlights, and some things that are almost complete, and circle back to the last time we talked, which was in 2016, believe it or not, about 18 months ago, and see how we did on the things that I was announcing in that prior presentation and where we're at. And then I'm going to talk about 4.3 and 5.0, and then from there, where we're going to continue. So let's talk about 4.1. And I will admit I was going to go through these a little bit more detail than I probably will now. But we launched call recording a long time ago, but we launched it as a call flow action. So you had to add it as a step in the call flow, and it was rather difficult to do and wasn't very flexible. We have since gone back and now made this a configuration parameter, just like all the rest of them, on the device user account hierarchy, so that you can, for instance, turn on inbound and outbound call recording on a user or a device or an account level. And you can more granularly control it on both off-net and on-net requests. If you my CDR talk yesterday, then that should make a lot of sense to you. But that's basically inbound calls that are coming or going to your carriers, as well as the ones that are within the system itself. It can also use the storage engine enhancements that we've done that I'll be mentioning briefly here in a moment. We also revamped the templates for the notification and the emails. Hassam spent a tremendous amount of time and work and effort trying to see if he could get an HTML template to show up the same way in more than one email client, including your mobile device. So if you refresh the templates, the ones that I originally did, which were full of spelling mistakes and just looked like plain text emails, even though they were actually HTML emails, are now very nice. They have clean headers around them. He corrected all my spelling mistakes. They're quite nice, and it gives you a much more professional look if you deploy those. So I'd highly recommend it. There is a sup command that will go in and upload the new templates, because by default it won't overwrite anything that you've customized in that regards. And we also ran into an issue, or one of the things in deployment, in practicality, or once you actually deploy the systems, you learn a lot in doing so. One of them was we had an issue with emails not being sent out as a result of the local mailer not being able to connect, and we were losing the voicemail to email notifications, which is something most customers rely on, especially in businesses. So there's a mechanism in there now that will actually go through and queue up any failures, as long as the local, we're not talking about delivery failures yet. We've been discussing ways to do that, but right now we're talking about the ability to even just send it out. So it will queue up any notifications that can't be sent and then retry them later, and you can control a lot of the parameters around how often how aggressively to retry there. And actually in the elevator the other day I was talking to somebody about some parking issues that had come up and had been corrected and had some ramifications. So parking is one of those things that there's always some new use case that we never expected every time we talk to somebody who's deployed it. There are a ton of people who have done some very interesting things with it and are using it in ways that we never anticipated. And so one of the enhancements that we did here is with regards to how it manages storing the state in the database. And what we originally rolled out, and after all of our testing we thought would be a stable solution, we had to go back through and make an additional adjustment to that. But that new enhancements that we've done to the parking system have made it extremely stable. And if you do have any parking slots, as the gentleman in the elevator did, that are not behaving properly, it's usually indicative of a single slot, not necessarily all the slots on the account, and just let us know and we can work with you to correct that. And so Monster UI, of course, got the necessary components to follow the back end. So there is a call recording app that corresponds with that call recording enhancement on the back end. And that application will go through and show you the call recordings that have happened, and it allows you to do all the necessary configurations so that you can enable and disable and do things of that nature. It also allows you to tell the Kazoo backend what storage engine you'd like to use. So for instance, Google Drive or AWS are the two that are currently in the application. Now the backend itself, what we tend to do is the backend tends to attempt to lead the UI. So the backend technically has alpha features for Azure Box, Google Storage, and the third one, Google Drive, but there's a third one I always forget. OneDrive, yeah. So those additional storage engines are coming. And right now they're only exposed as call recording endpoints, but the backend can also use those as your fax storage engine or your voicemail storage engine. So for instance, you could have all the faxes to the particular individual go to their, if you wanted to, personal Google Drive. And so they just show up on their laptop when they sync their machine. So that capability is available to you today. And all of that is powered by all of the tremendous authentication work that Luis here has done in bringing in a lot more support for OAuth. And I'll show you some of that in just a minute. But that also allowed us, or that also was part of a focus on the authentication. So we also brought in at the same time two-factor. So we right now have direct integrations for Duo, but that's a modular framework. What we like to do is build the foundations so that we can build off of that. So the two-factor isn't necessarily directly for Duo. Duo is the first module that is in the two-factor or the multi-factor engine. But the multi-factor engine is there so you can enable it and have that requirement of an alternate channel in order to log into the UI, which is especially more comforting for like your master account on your production system, things like that, where really no one should be logging into that unless it's really important. We also created an app for Blacklists. We've had Blacklists in the system. The real notable one as far as back-end changes go is one of the ways we handled anonymous blacklisting was by asking you guys just to put in an all zero caller ID. It was kind of a workaround, and it worked for a little while, and then we ran into problems with that. So there's now actually a configuration option that says block anonymous calls, and that is coming from the SIP headers and other things. But that one we could not maintain backwards compatibility. So if you were, well, it attempts to, but if you were, it still has the same bugs for the reason that we introduced the parameter. So if you are using the blacklists in the system, I'd highly encourage you, if you're trying to do the anonymous blocks, to switch to the new parameter. And we also have an application for Qubicle reporting. If you saw Mark's talk yesterday, you would have seen the hints around that. That initial reporting is just going to be basic reporting, and then the more advanced reporting we're continuing to work on, but that is probably something that will be pushing the data out and allowing you to build your reports, because the level of customization that's required at a call center is so astronomical that it's not really conceivable that we have the resources available to suit everyone's need. And the lowest common denominator very rarely plays to some of these large call centers. So for the small offices, the reporting that we'll offer will provide them the insights that they need, but for the large call centers, that's a reporting task that can be much better handled by people who build unique and or dedicated solutions for that kind of thing. We also revamped the presence architecture. So the presence continues to be one of the trickiest things to get right here. It's very hard to get the entire distributed system to agree whether or not a phone is online or offline, and handle when it can't actually talk to all the nodes in the cluster, and know that if the last thing that it heard was the call is currently off hook, but the server has disappeared and will never inform it that it is no longer on call, to turn off the light and not turn it off at the wrong time when they are still on the call. So there's a lot of that last 10% is always the killer. And so we've offloaded a lot of the work that Omnipresence was doing into C code that's directly in Kamailio, and Kamailio is now bound into more messages than it was prior to be able to make those determinations. But we also enhanced some of the ways that we manage those messages, so we actually did not take a performance hit from doing that. There are more connections in Rabbit, but Rabbit is capable of managing those, so it hasn't caused us any problems. And in addition to that, one of the ways that we were able to make some of those improvements is by moving off the DB text. There was a talk yesterday that was introduced this, and I forget if it was Derek or Sean, so I apologize. But as we enhanced Kamailio and our ability to get state and information in and out of that database within the scripts and within the C code, we were slowly building out SQLite within the DB text module itself. So we decided we might as well just go ahead and switch. So we have switched to using the SQLite to back the stateful data, and that has also given us some ability to even go in and query the presence data in real time as well in our debug app and collect some information in a more efficient manner. We also are now doing dispatcher discovery, and again, coming back to being able to utilize that more flexible DB. So what this is in Sean's demo, he showed or demoed one of the things is binding into a RabbitMQ exchange, and for those heartbeat messages, and those heartbeat messages come from all nodes. So Kamailio is publishing heartbeats into KAZOO, telling it what roles it's running, what dispatcher nodes it knows about, and whether or not it can actually ping them, what its backup set is, how many subscriptions it has, how many presence requests it's trying to fulfill. And when FreeSwitch is sending those heartbeats, it's collecting those, identifying if that FreeSwitch is in the local zone and adding it automatically to the list optionally. You can disable it if you have a complicated network, but by default, it will then auto-discover any FreeSwitch server that comes into the node. So if you wanted to spin up a new FreeSwitch server, you no longer have to go configure all of the Kamailios. So if you had 6 Kamailios and you just turn on one FreeSwitch, they all know about it, and some of them will load it into their backup list if they're on a different zone, and some of them will load it into their primary if they're on the primary zone. And then with the SIP option pings, of course, they won't accept any traffic until eCall Manager is connected. So this is working towards a goal of the yum space install space KAZOO, primarily for development, right? That's never going to be a production model for deploying that. But also if you were going to maybe put this on premise, or if you needed to deploy this for testing or QA purposes or other things, that gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility as far as being able to spin up single node servers very quickly with zero configuration. And because those heartbeats are carrying that information, when you do the KAZOO application space status, which Sean ran yesterday, you see that information. So in one glance, you can see if, again, coming back to my hypothetical 6 Kamailio servers, can all 6 Kamailio servers see all of the FreeSwitch nodes on all the zones? And are they actively pinged right now? Are they replying in a timely manner? And so it gives you a tremendous insight into the network health. And have I accidentally blocked ports? Have I not allowed certain things? We also have the uptime of Kamailio. So for those of you who do maintenance and maybe you're doing a rolling restart or something else like that, when you start to grow into large clusters and you're in the middle of doing a rolling restart, hopefully you're using Cluster Manager, but if you're old school, and I still do it manually sometimes. If a call comes in, you might forget which one you were on. You just run the status command. It tells you which one's in their uptime, and you know exactly where you're at in the restarts. It also tells you the version. So if you're doing an upgrade, you can also verify that all of them have the proper version at any particular time, which we've been able to do with the KAZOO applications. And we can do that through the uptime through the connection with eCall Manager to FreeSwitch, but now we can also do it with Kamailio, which is tremendously helpful for admins. So, KAZOO 4.2 is the latest stable release that's gone out, and I highly encourage everybody to update to it. It's primarily bug fixes, but we also closed a vulnerability. So there was a condition that would expose the username and password of your AMQP message bus if you're using WebSockets. So if you connected in, potentially you could leak the username and password of the AMQP message bus. It's a very minor, don't get scared yet, it's a very minor vulnerability in that no one has access to the AMQP message bus as far as the ports. If they do, you've got bigger issues that we need to talk about anyway, but you don't necessarily want to be leaking credentials for obvious reasons, so that was patched. There was also a lot of work on outbound conferencing, so you can now, using APIs, establish outbound legs into existing and or ad hoc conferences, and in doing so you can pass in additional profiles, so you can override all of the various entry tones and everything else on an ad hoc conference that's establishing an outbound leg. And if you link all of that back to the announcements I was making on the CDR talk, and I hinted at the fact that there was a lot more power in that custom application variables, you can now build outbound legs that then come back around as pivot requests in a conference that have the state of your running application, and then you can statelessly build very interesting solutions with this. As a minor note, but awesome optimization, we historically, when you run the migrate command, have read the views off the disk and then gone through database by database to verify that all the views match what's on disk. There are reasons that's not super efficient, and in addition, for people who are building custom applications, that means that wherever you run the migrate command, you have to have that application installed because it needs to be able to read the view off the disk. Now, in a modular system like ours, our application deployment is not homogeneous in that not every box has every KAZOO application running and or even installed in the first place. So call flows may not be installed on the box where the maintenance command got ran, and therefore those views aren't updated. So to address that, give you additional flexibility and being able to ensure that you can deploy and know that those views are pushed out, we have moved the views into a database, and then they pull them into the accounts from there, which is much, much faster and a lot easier to manage from an application standpoint. And we also moved, because we embedded Erlang, we've been able to bump the Erlang versions without you knowing. And so on 4.2, we're up to Erlang 20.3, keeping up with the latest and greatest of Erlang. 19.3, sorry, yes. We also refreshed the login page on Monster UI. I don't know how many of you guys have an account or know about our sandbox. So that should be a lot of you because there was a lot in there. That's okay. So let us know if you need or want an account on Sandbox. But let me just pull this up. This has been sitting there for a while. So this is the new login page. There's a couple things to note here. So on the bottom left, you can note that there's some social callouts that are there. Those are configurable via the new branding manager. So you can remove those if you don't want them. Obviously, the new look, that orange stripe that's coming through is not the default. That's been white labeled. So you can actually colorize, I'm using a term now, to match your branding colors as well as the customizations we've always allowed you as far as the logo and the additional welcome message. And then on the bottom, you can optionally turn on and off the single sign-on with some of the common service providers, tying again into the authentication that's also allowing us to do things like talk to the storage engine and things like that. And so hopefully I'm going to burn into a little bit further time, but I do think it's useful to show. Let's see if we can. And this is a quick side note. So the other day, Darren was telling me that somebody who was speaking to someone, they were surprised that there were hotkeys on Monster UI. So if you hit your question mark, it will bring up the hotkey list here, and this side of it will change based on the application. The other side is static. This is super, super, super convenient for people who live in this UI like I do. D is your debug. This is also my best friend in the world. Gives you your auth token, your account ID, lets you know whether or not the WebSockets are connected, tells you the backend version if you're a super duper admin and that you run the system. You can actually determine what the backend version you're talking to. You also have the UI version that you're using at this time. So a very, 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 very handy tool. It even goes as far as these boxes, of course, will copy paste for me. So if you wanted to do that, it's super, super convenient. But if I come up here, I was just going to show off here the branding. And again, it took focus, enter, will then auto-select into it. So the new branding manager is showing you kind of as you go through, because this seems to confuse it. The old way of doing the domains was very confusing, and I admit I also confuse myself on it occasionally. So we've gone through and revamped that. We're also showing you when you upload these things, and then if I were to upload certain things that would show in real time, how they're going to display on the next page. And we also advanced over here to the templates. I can show you some of the templates now. Here we go. So if we look at some of the new templates that I was talking about before, that's not the best example, I'm afraid. But yeah, you can see it's already much, much, much cleaner. Sorry. Should mirror my screen. I thought it would be faster this way. But anyway, the new templates are all here, and I would encourage you guys to go take a look at them. And the new branding app is kind of towards this refresh of, now that we know how people are using it and where they're stumbling, we can go back and refresh these applications to really polish the user experience and make sure that, that you guys have the best possible experience here. And we were on the slide. So We also added a feature for the super duper admins, and this is actually one of my favorite features in 4.2. So in Smart PBX, if you're signed in as a super admin or in advanced call flows and you switch to a user object, so you're listing a user, there's a new button on there called Impersonate. If you click Impersonate, it drops your authentication and it establishes authentication as that user. You cannot get out of it because that would be a security vulnerability, or at least potentials for it. So once you do that, you're locked in as that user. But this means if you have a user call up your support line and say, every time I click on I can't find this app, then you go impersonate them and you see exactly what they're seeing, because as far as the system is concerned, you are them. We do add there is one caveat to that. We do add the fact that you are impersonating that user and where you came from, so that we can log that on our audit logs, and we know that it wasn't actually John Smith who made the change, but you are making that change with the authentication of John Smith or whoever you impersonated. We also moved to Kamailio 5.x, and I don't know if you guys look at our repo, the way that because we build Kamailio, we tend to be ahead of where they're at as far as we, of course, issue everything back to them as far as PR anytime that we make changes. But rather than wait for them to produce a build from those PRs, what we tend to do is build those early so we can start our QA testing and launch sometimes before they actually run the build. So if you look at our versions, they end in letters. The letters are our variants of that version of Kamailio. So 5.0.4 J, yeah, 5.0.4J is the version that fixed a vulnerability that Kamailio announced. So it's not something we actually did. Kamailio announced a vulnerability. They had a fix for it. So if you haven't updated yet, I highly recommend that you update to the J variant, because that was the build we ran that has the vulnerability correction in it. Some quick other highlights. Cluster Manager has launched. It's being used by a lot of people and managing quite a number of servers. Since I've been doing this for so long, I'm still trying to get myself in the habit of signing into it, because I'm still immediately, just by muscle memory, hit terminal SSH and then think about what I was about to do. So I'm trying to get in the habit of going into the browser and doing it, but it is super convenient. And actually, I have done upgrades while I was cooking dinner, which is really fantastic, because normally you have to sit there and continuously type. So actually, I'm really pleased about this, and it's coming along, and there's some very exciting stuff coming down the pipe that makes it more convenient than SSHing in the first place, including the ability to manage the system config. So even like having to manage a tunnel and go into the database and sign into the thing, just click the button, save, hit go, and it roll it out. The hooks within it allow it to then roll through, knowing which services to restart automatically. So I can make a single change, and it understands that that change impacts these 6 Kamailio servers and has to perform a rolling restart of them after it deploys the new configuration. It's fantastic. Provisioner enhancements, tons of new phones. I think on Sandbox, if you take a look, we've been adding phones as fast as the manufacturers are creating them, and sometimes before. The added support for firmware, so you can now control what firmware variants are being pushed out to the phone, and increase security, as the question that Darren was asking was hinting at. Some of you have been tripped up by that. Apologies, but it is a cat and mouse game, and there are quite a few people who love to scan the provisioner because it is a very juicy target. If you are able to get in, there's a lot of sensitive information in there. The new documentation site was demoed, so working on trying to make that a more friendly thing, and there's a lot more work coming into that, including the ability to reference internal documentation about developing within Erlang. So you will have a lot of access to that if anybody is interested and or developing in the actual core of the product itself. And too fast. But Tower Power was also refactored, which expanded the ability to push out into third-party switches, and has been relaunched with the lessons we learned there. So some things that still need a few tweaks. We have a bunch of beta apps that are on Sandbox that are going to be pushed out into production here very, very, very soon. They are coming up to their final versions. If you are playing with those and you find any issues there, please do let us know. Goblin, for those of you who don't know, is our kind of UI for support. It's designed to ask you the proper questions depending on what you're filing, so that we can automate things like the log collection. So for instance, if you're filing an issue about a particular call that had a problem, you give me the call ID as part of the ticket you file. and that log aggregate servers and the rest of it that Darren was hinting at, I can now go collect those logs. So by the time it goes to an engineer, they've got everything they need, and they don't have to spend time collecting information, asking you, oh, which account was that again? What call was that again? And figuring out exactly how to get the logs for that information. And we have an internal project, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do it justice. I did want to break down into a demo here to show off a huge amount of work that Ed has been working on called Baggage Claim, and GetSwitch is its UI for that. But those are our Baggage Claim is our internal build system that produces the packages themselves. And we have revamped that practically entirely to be able to support Debian and do proper builds of the meta packages. There's been occasions where meta packages have caused some issues, so we're working in order to correct that. And actually, as a matter of fact, we do have Debian builds right now for everything. So that is coming. It's not something we will officially support with 2600 Hertz yet. So we're no one needs to rush out and start formatting their OS. It's an option primarily for developers, open source community members, and anybody else who would like to try it. And then we will slowly introduce that once our support staff has the tooling around being able to support a Debian environment, because we've been on CentOS for so long that is our primary environment. So I'll skip that. Sorry. So basically, there's things we got, things we didn't, but we did pretty darn good. So thank you. 4.3, the billing engine is the primary reason, was the primary driving factor for the 4.3, and that is a complete rewrite. The reason that we do need a complete rewrite is the original billing engine that is existing was written for our purposes. And we asked that, well, we originally would inform people that this is just something we wrote for us. We're not interested in writing a billing program. If you want to bill with Kazoo, find an outside solution. Turns out that the billing engine was actually pretty good, and a lot of people found that it met their needs, so they used it, but it has tremendous growing pains, including the fact that it's tied directly to Braintree, which is a huge, huge problem for us. So we do need to do a refactor, and this is one of those where maintaining backwards compatibility does not provide us with enough benefit, because we need to correct some fundamental mistakes in the billing engine as far as making, again, coming back to making that foundation where you can then build off of it, because it was, like I say, just kind of a hack-together solution for us. Well, not necessarily hacked, but it was a specific solution for us and not built to be as flexible as it needs to be. So the other one that's coming out, and this is something that maybe you're noting a trend here, is some of these things like the billing engine themselves were introduced, but they had no clear delineation between whether or not we intended that for public consumption yet, or it was just something we were working on, or something that was in the core because we needed it on ours. So we're working on what we call the stability restrictions. I don't have a good way to name this, but basically what this is, and this one is simple, is in the schemas there's a parameter that tells us whether or not the thing that schema is referencing, that property, is alpha, beta, or stable. And then on a cluster environment, you can set up whether or not you want to accept API requests that are carrying alpha, beta, or stable parameters. And so what that lets you do is on your dev environment, you can play with the alpha parameters, but on your production environment, if you issue a request that's trying to do something with an alpha parameter, it would be rejected, so you're not risking stability on that system. This also lets us accept PRs quicker, because if you're adding parameters into, say, like the device endpoint, right, we can mark that alpha, roll it out into production. The production environment will reject it, but we can allow the QA to continue on that particular build, so we don't need to hold it back while we QA, because the QA can be configured to allow the alpha parameters while the production is rejecting it for the exact same build. So it's trying to bring about a lot more transparency. So that leads me into Kazoo 5.0. So I know the closed source is a big, scary thing, and everyone always worries that we're getting further and further away from our open source roots, and that's absolutely not true. I can't express that enough. We're trying to be transparent. And it's also one of those ironic things is we're regularly asked to be more transparent about, how are we feeding the engineers and what parts are we giving back to the open source community. And we keep doing such a bad job with it that when we mention the fact that we do have some closed source stuff, that people get really worried that we're not then contributing it to the open source. So having elements in there like those particular flags that allow you to control the stability allow us to push things into the open source that we don't think are ready yet, that still need further testing, that maybe came from some closed source stuff that is moving towards the open source, because that's the way that we have historically operated. Is we produce it as a closed source solution so that we can test it, we can see if it actually works, if it's stable, if it works at scale, if we can package it. Just a tremendous amount of stuff. And then we move it into the open source is how we have historically worked, because we throw away quite a lot of ideas that just don't work. They're not going anywhere, they're not stable, or they don't scale. So rather than having an unstable platform, we've been keeping them closed source, so having these additional components allow us to then make these delimitations a lot cleaner, so that you guys aren't so confused about why did this thing that I've just built this new tool change, or go away or do something, right? So that's what we're working and focused on right now. And of course, as Darren also mentioned, as our foundational pieces get much closer, things like the core of the platform itself need to be much more rigorously tested, and the pull requests against that need to be much more rigorous than, say, the pull request against a particular application that doesn't necessarily have risked the entirety of the platform. So what we're going to do is we're going to break up the KAZOO application much like Monster UI, where the applications themselves are different repos, and the different repos can then follow a different build path. They can have a different test suite against them, and we can clearly say that this particular repo is one that is now community maintained, or this is one that we are actively working on and would recommend that you would honor it if you rolled out into your production environment. It makes it transparent for everybody. It makes it a lot cleaner and a lot easier, and I hope that people aren't worried about the closed source. I won't be here when the open source isn't a fundamental component of the company, so I do hope that people take my word for that. So KAZOO 5.0, turnkey billing and invoicing, is a primary focus of the platform. I really wish I could do a lot more justice to the Mod KAZOO work that is coming out here. So Mod KAZOO in FreeSwitch is the primary application that we use to interface with it. There was a lightning talk by Louise here who did an amazing job with the showing off some of the, did amazing work with changing the events around within the C code on FreeSwitch so that eCall Manager doesn't have to do so much work with it, which really, really cool stuff coming from that as a result of that. Every year, Big Couch, I know it's old, I agree. It also is working, but we do need to get to Couch DB 2.0. 5.0 is going to be the one we do that with. And the audio and SIP self-debug tools, as a result of some of the Mod KAZOO work we're doing, will now be able to give you audio statistics within your CDRs so that you can do analysis on MOS scores, things like that, so you can go back and take a look. It's primarily driven by the RTCP stuff, but gives you that additional capacity. Faxing, oh man, how much longer are we going to continue doing faxing? But we're going to build yet another tool to enable some type of workaround, because somebody thought it was a good idea to packetize something that was originally built to run on something that was guaranteed timing. So we're going to do a store and forward engine in there. It's what the T.37 is, in order to give you some capabilities, because generally speaking, your faxes can make it at least to the server or from the server to the carrier. One way or the other usually works, but that whole through end to end is such a trick to get right. Boy, I wish I had more. Okay, so the KAZOO Pipes is named by Pierre, who has moved on to start his own company, so we wish him well. But the KAZOO Pipes is basically building an audio chain path via the APIs and or other means, so that you can tie into some of these more real-time integrations with Google Translate and the rest of them that are now coming up, that are making their services available, so you can reach into the system and have streams come out in various formats, and perhaps even do various other manipulations against them, and then push them out without taking on any of the SIP overhead and things of that nature. Think shoutcast streams with auto-tune. Omni-channel into Qubicle. So the idea of Qubicle, and one of the bullets that we missed, is we didn't hit a contact center in Qubicle, but we currently have a call queues, almost call center, and the idea is to get there to a contact center where we can accept text messages, instant messages, things like that, and they all go through the same queuing mechanism. It is foundationally architected like that. It's also one of the reasons that we had to do a complete refactor on that one, because the foundational components of AC/DC didn't allow this to go into there cleanly. And of course, right now, the only channel that we accept are the voice channels, but the omni channel is coming. And Coming back to the talks that JR showed you, the onboarding, we're trying to make that very easy for you guys. So we had a really early attempt at a templated system where you would set up one account, mark it as templated, and it would attempt to then clone that every time you made a new account. Never really worked really well. We need to circle back and solve that. And that comes back to, once again, one of those ideas that I threw together in kind of a couple days, threw it up because at the time the project was very new and there wasn't anyone using it, so it really didn't matter. And then later when people started using it, it fell apart, so we had to change it, turn it off, tell people not to use it. And that messaging was very confusing for people because it was on their production environment and there, and we're saying don't do it. So that's what we're trying to get to with some of this transparency work that we're trying to do. The zero config install I already talked about. The Kamailio routing engine, that's a wholesale routing engine running directly in Kamailio because we have such tremendous capacity, both by moving off of the DB text, but also because of the enhancements into the module themselves. So we have a lot more scripting capability and connections through the MQB message bus there. So we can do a lot of really cool routing stuff there. The app exchange for everyone. We want all the community members to have access to all the applications that live in the app exchange, but in order to do that, some of you need to be able to license that, ensure that there's some safety and protection around the code that you're deploying, especially if it's a proprietary thing that you've developed or expensed in-house. So we're working on solving that problem within Erlang. And ease of provisioning, I want to reiterate because I don't know if it was fully caught by that demo that was done up here today, but the when they came up here and they put that E-Link up on this desk, they never touched it they just pulled the power and put it back in and it provisioned. So they put an E-Link out of the box on the table, they went to Monster, they hit save, and then they plugged it in. And that is that kind of zero-touch provisioning that is the dream, and we're so close to it. A couple more little tweaks, and we can even do things like perhaps even, and I'm not making this promise yet, but it is something we are working on. Things like you pick up the phone once it auto-provisions because it's gone back to some base server. It asks you for the PIN number that's on the screen or some other unique identifier, and then has done the association, the link directly with it. We can also do other interesting things, and I know that the security concerns in here, so again, these are all forward-thinking ideas here, but you could put a phone onto a desk and it can do the auto-provisioning, and we could detect the IP that's coming from, detect that there's other devices that are on there, and automatically build a device within KAZOO, provide it credentials immediately so that when you go on to the KAZOO itself, within that account, the device has added itself into Smart PBX. You just associate it with a user, and if you circle all that all the way back around to that user portal that he demoed that would run within the application itself, if perhaps that was the first step that you installed, then it has a little pop-up that says, now pick up your phone, dial 123. That association is now automatic from a user standpoint. That's unbox phone, plug it in, pop-up comes up on the screen saying type in 123 on the phone, and you're done, which would be amazing. Native mobile app we did a little demo for, SMS, MMS support we continue to work through. Again, not a technical blocker, but we're going to get there. It's a trick, but we're getting there. User portal, he also obviously demoed. Web phone, the WebRTC. I've been debating, we have to come up with a good term. I don't think the industry, everybody calls it a WebRTC, but WebRTC has other meanings. It's such an overloaded term, so I tend to go with web phone being a soft phone that runs in a browser. It doesn't really work. Browser phone, B phone, I don't know. We got to come up with something. Also, personally, one of the most embarrassing components for the community is that we don't actually have an open source carrier application. If you deploy KAZOO, you can do pretty much everything in the UI except for add carriers, which is kind of important on a telephony communication system. So gonna get a carrier app and as fast as possible. Porting management has already gone through a significant refactor on the back end. We need more tooling on the front end in order to be able to allow resellers of resellers and things like that to be able to selectively manage, because sometimes the resellers are buying from you and sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're porting numbers with bring your own carrier, and sometimes, so there's a lot of conditions that need to be met in order to properly handle the porting. The OAuth stuff I hinted at, and I'm teasing here, Samuel, so there's a lot of very interesting stuff if you want to come see Luis's talk later today that you can do with linking to external systems. It's a little technical, but I would highly encourage it. Not to downplay any other talks that we're having here. The enhanced reporting that we're working on, I've been talking to a couple people about the kind of things that you want to see in CDRs, but there's other pieces of information like, do you want to know how many active calls there are across a cluster as a UI element? implement because that would be an API, and where do you feel on the security concerns of how much information do you want to leak about the entirety of the cluster to your potential customers? Because of course, anytime you put in a UI, no matter how hard you try, there is a potential risk for a security vulnerability there. And you do everything you can, you bright test to make sure that doesn't happen, but if it's just not there in the first place, then it can't be a leak. Because there's a lot of APIs I would otherwise create that would make my life a lot easier, but it's just, if it's not there, can't be hacked. Location support, this is another one that has been regularly asked for. So this would allow you, and there was actually even a gentleman earlier today who was walking by and talking about the ability to call extensions between accounts, extensions specifically. And location support would kind of meet that same use case without needing to have multiple accounts. It's a concept we've had in a long time, but you can see it's actually pretty darn far along. And obviously these are mock-ups, these haven't been built yet, but we've got the specifications. I've finally laid out what I believe to be the best way to move forward on this, and this also leads into work around geographic zones and being able to say that this customer is located primarily in the New York area or something like that, so that when you go out and reach to your carriers to provision, you can tell them that this call, these numbers that I've just purchased for this account should primarily route to New York, but here are my other backup servers when that's not available, things of that nature, in order to keep your resources local to the customer as much as possible. So that is the fastest I've done that talk. I think we're either back on track or maybe it was too fast. I don't actually know. But if you guys have any questions, like Darren said, we have the Q&A panel, and I'm happy to answer them as you come around. And while Ron Shear is coming up here to take me off this, because Darren mentioned it, if you cut back to my slides there. Or not. There we go. The pool party is actually reality. That far one is version 3, so we're getting there. It's never right to the 3rd version. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Karl.